Okay, welcome back. Really, really nice to see you. I hope that you had a good Christmas. Did you have a good Christmas? I know that many of you did. I've heard some good stories. I've heard some quite tough stories as well, but I'm sure, hopefully most of us had a good rest and a time of refreshment, and you're raring to go for 2014. I'm looking forward to going through this book of Nehemiah over the coming few months, and we are going to read from chapter 1. I'm going to just read the first 11 verses, chapter 1, verses 1 to 11. So let me read to you. It says this: the words of Nehemiah, the son of Hakaliah. Now it happened in the month of Chislev, in the 20th year, as I was in Susa, the capital, that Hanani, one of my brothers, came with certain men from Judah. And I asked them concerning the Jews who escaped, who had survived the exile, and concerning Jerusalem. And they said to me, the remnant there in the province who had survived the exile is in great trouble and shame. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates are destroyed by fire. As soon as I heard these words, I sat down and wept and mourned for days. And I continued fasting and praying before the God of heaven. And I said, O Lord God of heaven, the great and awesome God, who keeps covenant and steadfast love with those who love him and keep his commandments, let your ear be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer of your servant, that I now pray before you day and night for the people of Israel, your servants, confessing the sins of the people of Israel, which we have sinned against you. Even I and my father's house have sinned. We have acted very corruptly against you. We've not kept the commandments, the statutes, and the rules that you commanded your servant Moses. Remember the word that you commanded your servant Moses, saying, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the peoples. But if you return to me and keep my commandments and do them, though your outcasts are in the uttermost parts of heaven, from there I will gather them and bring them to the place that I have chosen to make my name dwell there. They are your servants and your people, whom you have redeemed by your great power and by your strong hand. O Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant, to the prayer of your servants who delight to fear your name, and give success to your servant today, and grant him mercy in the sight of this man. Now I was cupbearer to the king. So we're talking about a man whose life was transformed in one day, dramatically transformed in the story that I just read to you. And this is a story of an ongoing transformation. What starts in Nehemiah's heart in chapter 1 goes on to affect the whole city that he goes back to in chapter 2 and beyond. And the story, as you'll discover, unfolds to the nth degree. There's just more and more change, transformation. It's very inspiring, actually. It's a beautiful story of the powerful effect of God's Spirit at work in one group of people to bring radical change to the whole culture of a city. And as such, it can inspire us as we aim to build church community here in this city of Brighton and beyond, into Shoreham and at the racecourse and in Hove. We are on a mission that in many ways is very similar to the one that Nehemiah learns to have from this very opening stage of the book of Nehemiah. But it's also, as I say, the story of his personal change. And at the outset of a new year, that's a resonating idea, isn't it? Transforming for good. At the start of New Year, gym subscriptions are always boosted. The gymnasiums do great business in January. They talk about this annual plan that you can come on, and you come in with your eyes like saucers saying, that sounds like a great deal. All I have to do is make sure I come back every week for 12 months, and then I've really made my money. Good luck. The self-help books go off the shelves in Waterstones and Amazon.com. These are the days of aspiration. I'm not mocking that at all. I applaud it. In fact, I think it's good to use moments, use natural seasons in life like January to take stock and consider, what can I do this year to change? How can I develop? Personal change, personal development is a huge industry. It's the time when the magazine articles on 7 ways to snatch back time, manage your time better, 7 ways to spend less, save more, 7 ways to improve your marriage this year, 7 ways to get married this year, 7 ways to improve your relationships, to improve your sex life, 7 ways to do this. It doesn't always 7, but it just happens to be the number that seems to be glued into my head. You get the idea. This is the time for aspiration. And for some people, the aspiration takes kind of epic proportions. They do it to an extreme degree. They change everything. They don't just have the cosmetic makeover. They transform. That's happened in the case of a few people that I know. In fact, to be honest, I suppose that's the case for everyone who's become a Christian. More on that later. But the people I can think of, I think of a friend of mine who was working in the city of London, very lucrative job. Had his future nailed down. He'd had a good education, very nice upbringing, upper middle class family. You could have written the story of the rest of his life pretty easily. He was going to be one of those achievers in London, and he had his life made up. Dramatically, in a quite unexpected way, he was suddenly overcome with a profound sense that he should set off and go to Central Africa, where he still lives many years later, to serve in helping to raise up pastors, church leaders in the most war-torn part of Central Africa for the last 20 years, in Burundi and Rwanda. And he's been pouring his life out there for, I guess, 10, 20 years in the most extraordinary way. The stories, the letters he sends me of what he's up to are extraordinary. Some of them are devastating. Talk about a life change. Quite sudden. And that does happen. Sudden life change. Nehemiah's a bit like that. I guess if you watch movies, you occasionally see movies that hinge on a figure whose life changes dramatically, someone who kind of goes for broke, who just decides to change everything. Some people, it's like change for the sake of change. It's like, I just have to get out of the monotony of life. They're so frustrated and bored literally almost to death by the suburban monotony of ordinary life, just the 9 to 5, just the predictability, just this is what society's cooked up for me, is it? Well, this is what I've got to take, okay. Movies like Fight Club, you might have seen it. It's quite an old film now, but it's a very good example of this, where a guy who, effectively, he kind of pushes himself off the edge of society. He gets to a point of crisis where he gets so bored and so fed up with the dreariness that he becomes like an outlaw almost. He becomes a person whose world has to revolve around his new identity. He's got to be true to this gut feeling that I've got to be free, and so he sort of walls himself off in an extraordinary way. And movies, sometimes less kind of weird than Fight Club, will tell a similar story. And these things can attract us if we watch them, if we listen, if we read them. We think, imagine everything changing. Because we are inspired by the idea of the cause and being sold out for something, having a passion, a cause that fixes our attention. Here in Brighton, we're very passionate about ecological concerns. And many in Brighton would sacrifice, would give time, money, energy to see that the planet becomes greener and this city gets greener. That's a very popular cause amongst many in our city. And there'll be other causes as well that grip the attention of people here, us lot, across this part of the world. But I think there's a bit of a difference, having said that, between that kind of passion and what we see in Nehemiah here. If you read his prayer that we read just now, if you look at his life, you see that he's motivated by more than just his personal desire for a kind of a spiritual makeover, if you like. And also more than a desire for a flag to wave, a cause to tout. He's also motivated even deeper than that by history. He feels that he belongs to history. You read his prayer, you realize this man is aware of a story behind his own life that goes back centuries. It goes back generations, his family, his tribe, his nation. He feels part of a national cause, But in a sense, it's even greater than that. He feels like there's a story that God is telling, God's great big story. It goes deeper. You watch those programs like Who Do You Think You Are? And you see, these unlikely people like, Jeremy Paxman or Mariella Frostrup or someone, suddenly sobbing because they are confronted with the past and what went back in the family tree affects them today. And I guess in a way, when we watch those programs, we're touching something here of what Nehemiah is going through. He's feeling that he's a part of his past. He's got roots. But as I say, the roots aren't just his own family. The roots are to do with something even bigger, a big plan, a big purpose. There's some big story. There's some big plan that God means to tell. Some great story that God means to tell, that God is kind of weaving together. There's a headquarters somewhere in heaven where God is superintending the affairs of heaven and earth towards a great big destiny. And Nehemiah, he's feeling it. He's not just believing it and knowing it, he's feeling it. It's got to a point of, it's become visceral, it's in the guts. Now, I'll be honest with you, as a preacher, I find this difficult. Because preachers aren't that different from worship leaders. We're all kind of wired the same. We want to see a room come alive. We don't want stony faces. And I know worship leaders enough to know that there's a temptation at least to reach for the power ballad that will get hands up, whether or not the words are good, it's got great chords, so people, just anything we can do just to kind of get the room, come on, wake up. Our worship leaders are far too mature to succumb to that temptation, but it is a temptation, and preachers are no different. We feel this need for it, when I'm planning a Sunday, I want it to preach. I want it to be something that'll preach. That will resonate, because that's in the culture, that's in the ether, that affects people. They're feeling that. But I find it difficult to know how to get Nehemiah to resonate in 21st century Brighton. I hope he will. It may take months. But I've got to say, he's very different. He comes from a different world than most Brightonians, at least. If you're from another country, maybe if you're an African, you might see this a little different. You might have more in common with Nehemiah than I do. Because generally in countries like ours, we've kind of got rid of the idea of the big story, the big historical purpose of history. It just doesn't toast our bread. We don't really believe in it anymore. 100 years ago I predict this year, don't have to be a prophet to predict it, you will hear a lot about the First World War, because it started 100 years ago. And you know what happened in the First World War? Pretty much that was when the idea of the big story, the big idea, the big plan for history died. Because up till 1914, there was a big story that dominated the Western countries. It was a story of progress. Progress. There's a plan, there's a purpose. Now, it wasn't a Christian idea, okay? I'm not saying it was a good idea. I'm just saying it was an idea, and it dominated the culture. We're going somewhere. Mankind has evolved from the slime through the zoo. Someone said, from the goo through the zoo to you. Right? That's evolutionary philosophy nailed in 3 phrases. We've kind of come through various phases, and as man gets more scientific, more technological, more politically astute, more able to educate the masses, we will gradually create a society which is just progress. Progress is the order of the day. We will get more and more civilized. And of course, what happened in 1914 was we used all our science and technology to obliterate each other. And the idea of progress died a painful death for about 20, 30 years. To the point where now, it wasn't just because of wars, but that was a contributing factor. Now, most people don't really get excited by the idea of a big global purpose to history. We're more excited by my personal story. The new you, the new me, my plan, my story. What's my life? How's it all about me? And when I preach, I know that I'm always working in a context in Brighton where I will get people's attention quicker if I can show how this really applies to you, your needs, your problems, the difficulties that you face, the aspirations that you personally have. And as long as I'm on that wavelength, I'm winning, because then you're listening. But when I start saying names like Hanani, my brother, came with certain men from Judah, I can feel the room glazing over. I just know. It's like that Microsoft window, error 404 has occurred. So it's just, happened ages ago. It's no good. I don't know about Microsoft because I have a proper computer, but the idea that I kind of have lost the room. I think I lost the room in a different way just then, but the idea kind of dies. It just kind of withers on the branch. History? You want to talk about history in church? I come here to get my needs met. I come here to get fed personally. My personal, emotional, physical, spiritual needs. History? What's history got to do with it? It's a big deal. It's kind of a disease of our age. I feel like a painter who comes along with a big easel, filled with ideas about what I'm going to do. I'm going to come here and paint this big picture. It's going to be so good. I've got it all in my head. I've got these colors. It's going to be fantastic. And there's no canvas there. There's nothing there. And I think there's a couple of reasons for it. As I say, the big story thing I've kind of touched on already. But one of them is also that we tend not to really be very good readers of the Bible. I mean everybody. I mean Christians, people who aren't Christians. I find it interesting when I look back at the sermons written or preached by people who lived in centuries gone by. So one of my heroes, for example, would be Charles Spurgeon, who preached in London in the 1850s onwards, 1840s onwards. He was an extraordinary preacher. What I find interesting when I listen to him, who preached to thousands of very ordinary people in London, many very poor people in London who came to hear him preach. His sermons, when you read them, you realize he was assuming a lot from his listeners. He assumed that they knew their Bibles. He would say things like, it's a little bit like Elisha. Oh, it's a little bit like Eliezer. It's a little bit like Jeremiah. Oh, it's a little bit like Elisha's servant. It's a little bit like Eliab or Noah or Lamech or Jacob. And he'll just kind of throw these quotes and just move on. Now, if ever I mention Lamech, I have to say, there's this guy, right, called God, all right? And he wrote this book called the Bible. And, I have to trace back a few steps. And I'm not telling you off for that. I'm just saying, in our culture, we have to assume very little about how much Bible knowledge there is, because people generally aren't Bible readers. Now, sadly, I would say that's even true of Christians. I think as Christians, we've wandered a long way away from having a high expectation of reading our Bibles. We don't expect to find believers who are in the Bible all the time. And I think one of the reasons for that, perhaps, is that we wrestle with the idea the Bible is boring. It doesn't appeal to us. It doesn't inspire us. When we we're used to stories that are made to inspire us, aren't we? Maybe in the generation that we're in, we are particularly conditioned by that. We have cinemas where you can spend a bit of money and go in and get utterly taken up on every level. Every sense is provided for. I'm sure it will come when the cinemas have the sense of smell catered for as well. What you see, what you hear, everything is, and you feel so comfortable in your chair. You're just perfectly entertained. We expect that now. So I go see The Hobbit with my oldest son, and we're just mesmerized for 3 hours by this terrific epic that's unfolding in front of us. And people say, well, but that's different. I read this book, and it's lists of names. It's a bit difficult it's hard to penetrate. I don't really get into it. I feel like I'm struggling to understand what's going on so much of the time. In fact, I've heard that people use this as a reason, an objection against Christianity. I've heard people say, the Bible cannot be true because it's got boring bits in it. That's effectively what they're saying. They say it in a more sophisticated way than that. They say, this book is supposed to be God's message to us, is it? Well, you read the first few chapters of 1 Chronicles. What is it? About 7 chapters of names. How can that be God's word? Ha, ha, ha. You read the book of Leviticus. It's just a long description of how the priests used to set up their worship cult in the desert with animal fat and how much measurements of fat. How can that be God's word? Nonsense. This can't be God speaking. So what we do is we judge it on the basis that it doesn't quite fit our culture, our personal preference. It doesn't entertain us instantly, so it can't be God. Do you realize how ludicrous that is? That's utterly, talk about the tail wagging the dog. It's crazy. It's like, imagine on a huge movie set for one of these big epics like Titanic or Gladiator with thousands of people. And then one extra who just turned up for work that day, 7 months into the project, just put his toga on and he's kind of being told where to stand. They're just about to shoot and Russell Crowe's got his sword and it's all kind of, and he said, excuse me, can I just hold everything? Can I just stop? Can you just, the director's like, what did you want? Is it an emergency? I'm not feeling it. I'm not inspired. I don't like this story very much. You realize how ridiculous, that's kind of what we're saying when we say, I don't feel, I'm not very. The story isn't about you. It's actually mostly about God. And the fact that you are bored by it might be your problem. Maybe you're the one that needs to get relevant to the Bible rather than insisting that the Bible becomes relevant to you. There's a bigger story than the story of your life. The condition that we fall into if we yield to the kind of Hollywood culture where every story has to take our breath away within seconds or we ditch it is a bit like in the movie. I'm using movies a lot, today. Where in WALL-E, that film WALL-E, the kids' film, where those characters, it's projecting the current entertainment culture into the future. And you show the picture, let's get this picture up you see these characters here. This is their lives. They live behind these screens being constantly entertained. Robots do all the work. Everything is done. So human beings exist as these tubs of lard with perpetual milkshakes in their hands and screens which they just fiddle with to be just try to find entertainment. That's the way we're going, guys. That's where we're headed. Because we've set our culture up in such a way that I must be entertained. I must be. If you've read the book Brave New World by Aldous Huxley, you'll know what I'm talking about. The idea that the future is so shaped by entertainment, by amusement, that we lose our humanity. We stop being part of something bigger than us. It all has to perfectly fit. And we become superficial, shallow people, obsessed with our own little personal wanderings and meanderings instead of the big story, the big picture. We think, do I have to get into this book? Do I have to read this book? I have to carefully read it systematically? Do I have to read the boring bits? Really? It's a bit like when we were kids. My mum got a piano in, and she had a piano teacher come to teach my older siblings, my brother and sister, piano. I was too young, but they did some piano lessons. And within a few days, weeks, they learned how to play chopsticks. Now, I don't think the teacher had actually been as cruel as to teach them that. I think they picked it up from somewhere else. But my mum eventually banned chopsticks. It was the go-to tune. Every time the lid opened, it was that chopsticks tune. It was like, oh man, she was just fed up with it, as you would be. Because they didn't want to go through the discipline of months of scales. Listening carefully as she explained, the teacher, the difference between a quaver and a semi-quaver and a rest and a breathe and a semi-breathe and all of the scales and all of the chords and all the different ways, all the different time signatures. And then practiced for hours. But friends, the people that submit to that discipline are the ones that can sit down at a piano and take your breath away. It's the same with this book. If you see it as a treasure trove of memory verses for you, calendar verses, fridge magnet verses, little love letters from Jesus just a little verse to get me through the day. That's not wrong. I'm not condemning anyone for loving. I love that. I need every day to hear his voice. I meditate on little verses often. I love to do that. We must do that. But friends, there's another way with the Bible that's also essential. That is that you read the whole thing. You understand how it fits together. You get the big story. You get the big picture. You understand the big purpose and plan. What, plan for my life? God's wonderful plan for my life? No. God's wonderful plan for his son. God's glorious plan for history, which you are invited into. You can be involved as well. You get a role. But it's not all about you. It's about him. If that big picture, if that big promise, that big story hasn't begun to stir you, to break your heart as it broke Nehemiah's heart, you're missing out on something glorious, truly glorious. And if the one thing I achieve just a little bit today and as we go through this series is to help you to understand the bigness of God's plan through history, the big purposes of God, the big story that God has planned from the beginning to the end, that will be well worth the work. And it might take work for you. I insist that you see it that way, that we don't just come to be entertained by the Bible, even on a daily basis. You know, in the book of Proverbs, it says, Proverbs chapter 25, it is the glory of God to conceal things, but the glory of kings is to search things out. It's dignifying to you as a believer to search it out, to search the scriptures, to sometimes get a pencil, to sometimes read another book by someone who knows the Bible better than you, to do some theology, to do some work on it. Otherwise, we're only ever achieving a minor version of what's possible. It's worth taking the time. C.S. Lewis used to say, it's a little bit like going to the beach and loving the beach and thinking, I would love to explore the beach and the ocean even more. And then being told, right, you need to get some maps. You need to get some lessons on how to read maps. And you say, no, I didn't say that. I just want to enjoy the ocean. Well, good luck enjoying the ocean without maps. Good luck enjoying the Lake District without maps. I love the lake. I love going walking. I don't want these pansy maps and stupid things that people wear. It all looks so poncy. I can't stand maps, silly maps. Who needs maps? Who needs theology? Who needs story? Who needs all that? Who needs all these weird verses? Who needs that stuff? I just want to enjoy God. Well, good luck. And it's worth the time. It's worth the energy. It's worth the devotion. Let me put it to you at the start of the year practically. Here's a makeover thing. Who could read the Bible this year? Just do it in a year. That's a nice, easy discipline, actually. It's a lovely discipline. That's what I do. Just do it through every year. Just a few chapters every day. Oh, what a rich discipline. Every day, just a few chapters. Do you know what will happen to you? You'll hear from God more often than you do now. You'll also get very confused. You'll come to us with questions, good questions, great questions. You'll say, I don't get this bit, and the more I read this, I don't like God very much. Great. If your sentimental Santa Claus God gets sacrificed on the altar of reading the Bible properly, brilliant. You'll start to realize, oh, God's difficult and hard to understand and worthy of penetration, worthy of work, worthy of attention, devotion, disciplined thought. Do it. Do it this year. We were going to put some stuff on the screen, just a few items. There's a website, Bible.com, that I would particularly refer you to. YouVersion is a Bible app that you can get for your phone. In effect, this is making it very easy. You could do it while you're brushing your teeth. You could do it on a train, on a bus. You could just read just a couple of chapters. You'd be surprised how much you can get through in about 20 minutes every day. Just reading quickly. Find the time. I do 10 minutes in the morning, 10 minutes in the evening. It's great. Closing, starting the day. And as you do that, you're wrestling, you're learning. You're not just raking leaves, you're digging for diamonds. You're looking below the surface. You're finding more out about this God and his glorious, perfect story. And the ones that know the story, ones that are gripped by the story, they're more prepared for a start. It's like when Jesus rose from the dead. Do you know the story of those two men that met Jesus after the resurrection on the road to Emmaus? Luke chapter 24. They were very confused by what had happened. The crucifixion, they didn't expect that. He was the master. He was the savior. He was the king, and he got killed on a cross. Wrong. Went wrong. Something's gone wrong. Whole story's blown out of proportion. It's all wrong. And then they hear about the resurrection. These ladies are coming to tell. These women, silly women, shouldn't listen to them anyway. You know, it's an interesting thing. Oh, that's not my opinion, but I'm just quoting them. I heard the gasps. That's what they're saying. They're saying, it's all crazy. They're all confused. What does Jesus say? He says, Luke chapter 24, he says to them, "Oh, foolish ones, and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken." That's interesting, isn't it? His response is, was it not necessary that Christ should suffer these things and enter into his glory? Isn't that interesting? Jesus' response to them in their perplexity is, if you'd been reading your Bibles, you would have known this was all going to happen. If you read and understood the prophets, you wouldn't have been thrown by the cross. And you'd have known the resurrection was coming as well. If you read the Bible. And then it says he sat them down and he opened the scriptures and he showed them everything it said concerning himself. It says their hearts burned within them. I wish I was there. Their hearts burned as they read the whole Bible as one story with Jesus. And him pointing out, that's about me, that's about me. It's all a big plan. God's plan for me and my new creation that he's setting up, that he put into plan before the world was made. You get it as you read through it. And it takes discipline, but the more you do it, the more you actually find the scales turn into tunes. The things that look like difficult reads, they start to make you weep. Understand that this book is telling a bigger story than just the story of your life. It has to be. What's Nehemiah so moved by otherwise? Just finish very quickly by saying the three things that stand out here. Firstly, he is moved, deeply moved. He's filled with grief, really, because of the state of God's people. That's what the city of Jerusalem means, okay? You see it right there very, very quickly early on. It says, he's asked them concerning the Jews who escaped. And then he says in verse 6, "Let your ear be attentive to you and your eyes open to hear the prayer of your servant, that I now pray before you day and night for the people of Israel, your servants." He's praying with passion for God's people. He's jealous for God's people. Why? Because they're Nehemiah's tribe? No, actually. Not mainly. They were his tribe, but it's much more than that. He understands that they're God's tribe. God's people. God, you made a promise to our ancestor Abraham hundreds and hundreds of years ago that we would be your blessed, chosen people, and through us you would bless all the peoples of the earth. That was the promise you made Abraham all those centuries ago. And look at us now. Look at the city. Look at the land. Look at the mess we're in. And he grieves. Is that how you feel about the church? About God's people? I tell you, the church in our nation, the state it's in, the mess it's been in for hundreds of years, or at least for decades, I should say. The way it's wandered away from the truth. The way it's picked its image publicly and in the media is so far from the book, the people we read about in this book. It should grieve us. If it doesn't grieve us, we need to catch up with Nehemiah. We should be moved and inspired by him and moved in our hearts for the church. We so easily say, it's not about the church, it's about Jesus. I've got used to saying that to people who aren't Christians. I get used to saying, don't look at the church, whatever you do, look at Jesus. Look at Jesus. Don't look at the church. But I feel every time I say that, my conscience is troubled. Because I don't want to have to say that. I want to say, look at Jesus' people. Look at the glorious church. When I read this book, I think that's probably what gets said quite a lot in the early church. Look at this community. Look at the fire. Look at the life. Look at the joy. Look at the liberty. Look at the peace. Look at the love for one another. Look at the power, the answers to prayer. Look at them. They're mind-blowing. The people of God. And Nehemiah says they've become a laughing stock. They've become a derision. Become an embarrassment. The fact that the church today is like that should cause us to respond the same way he does here, with days of fasting and weeping. More about that next week. Second thing, God's purpose. God's people, God's purpose. God has a plan for history. As I said, his plan involves his son. You read this, you realize Nehemiah's praying that God would gather. Verse 9, if you return to me and keep my commandments and do them, though your outcasts are in the uttermost parts of heaven, from there I will gather them and bring them to the place that I have chosen and make my name dwell there. God's plan is a glorious people with a glorious king. The kings of the Old Testament died out. The last king, it's said about him in Zedekiah, it talks about the end of the book of 2 Kings. The Babylonians captured him. He disobeyed them when they tried to control him. He was very foolish. It says they killed his sons in front of him and took out his eyes. The last king of Judah. The end, surely the end of God's promise to David that he would lift him up and lift his son up so that there would be a son of David who would sit on God's throne forever. Surely it all finished when Zedekiah's sons were butchered and his eyes were taken. Isn't that the end of the hope? Then you get, as 2 Kings finishes, just a reference to Jehoiakim, the other Judah king before. And the Babylonian king sends for him, has him live in his house. As if to say, at the end of 2 Kings, the writer's just saying, there's still hope. There's still hope for a son of David. There will be a son of David on a throne one day who will reign over all things. Nehemiah's gripped by that hope. Jerusalem, Zion, there will be a king reigning in Zion. And Jesus came to the city of David. And the Bible says that there'll be a new Jerusalem, a new creation, a new city. Jesus will reign there forever and ever and ever. That's where history's going, friends. Nehemiah's gripped by it. He's stirred by it. He's passionate about it. His king. And then finally, he's passionate about God's glory. God's glory. That's what Zion is supposed to be. Again, verse 9, my place that I have chosen to make my name dwell there. You were made to dwell with God. Until you find the God of glory, not the God of your own life, your own plan, your own personal hopes and dreams, your own personal development, your own finance plan, your own marriage, your own kids, your own job. I'm not saying those things aren't important, friends, I promise you. They're very important. But they are utterly insignificant if you don't see them in the context of God's glory. When you see God's glory, those parts of your life, even the most mundane things, even the things you go and do this afternoon when you get home from church, become opportunities to be filled with the glory of God. Because they're all about him. They're not about you. They're about his glory, his purpose, his plan. That's where we're going. We'll understand it better as we keep reading. But we'll close there. I want Simon to come up and lead us.